And welcome to the Center for Civil Society. As you know, we are running a special webinar series on climate justice. It's been going on since March until April. And then today we are really excited. We're speaking to Alex on a green new Eskom. So Alex will be talking about how we can have affordable, reliable, and clean energy in South Africa. But then before I hand over to Dan to talk about the house rules, maybe I should just give you a quick bio about Alex. Alex Lenferna works as a climate justice campaigner with 350africa.org and serves as a secretary of the South African Climate Justice Coalition. He's a Mandela Rhodes and Fulbright scholar who holds a PhD focused on climate and energy justice from the University of Washington, and he has dedicated over a decade to research, writing, teaching, and activism on climate justice. His work, writing, and research are available at alexlenferna.com, which the website, I'll share it in the chat. Alex, welcome to the Center for Civil Society. We are glad that you made time to come and speak about this important topic for us.
Thanks for having me and for the generous introduction too. Appreciate it.
So yeah, I think Dan will take us through the CCS, webinar rules for the participants.
Thank you so much, Andres. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. I would like to explain some few ground rules. May our attendants mute their mics. And if you want to ask questions, can you please insert them in the chat box, and then we'll attend to them during the question and answer session. Alex, I just want one more thing from you. We seek permission to record this session. Would you allow us to record this session?
Yes, more than happy for you to record. Thanks, David.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll give you 30 minutes to give us your presentation. Thank you so much for your time. The floor is yours, Alex.
Thanks very much, Danford. Sanibonani, Mulwele, Dumelang, and hello everyone. It's nice to be with you all, and also nice to follow Danford. I just read one of his papers on ecological Ubuntu for a paper on climate fiction paper that I just wrote. So doing some good work out there. Nice to connect. So it's a pleasure to be with you today and to talk about, something that is affecting our lives in so many different ways, which is Eskom, which is, the biggest polluter on the continent, but also one of the bigger threats to South Africa's future prosperity if we don't get it right. And I've got some slides that I'm going to share. Hopefully those will work well. As Dan said, if you've got questions, feel free to pop them down in the chat and I can get to them either as we're going or, at the end even. So let me try share my slides and see if that'll work. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. So yeah, today's topic is transforming Africa's biggest polluter, and it's based on the Green New Eskom campaign driven by the Climate Justice Coalition, and draws quite heavily on a new booklet that we have put out on the Green New Eskom, which we recently put out, actually, in fact, just last week, which kind of outlines our vision for what the Green New Eskom could look like. As well as provide some information as to the nature of the problems with Eskom. So that's kind of where things are starting there. Alrighty. So just sort of the structure for today. Start off by introducing the Green New Eskom campaign, give a bit of analysis of the problems with Eskom, which I think a lot of us are painfully familiar with. Give a bit of an overview of the campaign's proposed solutions, talk a bit about Eskom's own just transition plans, and then ending off with a reflection on why the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy is likely the biggest obstacle to transformation on this front. So yeah, that's the structure for today. let me dive in. So the Climate Justice Coalition, which is a coalition of civil society, community-based organizations, trade union, and has sort of an intersectional vision of climate justice, which is bringing together people from health, human rights, energy justice, environmental justice, mining impacted communities, and so on. We're the ones who developed this sort of vision of the Green New Eskom campaign together. And we did it last year, initially with the purpose of doing a mass mobilization to Eskom based on these demands that we put together. And then the pandemic hit, and so it turned a little bit into more of a campaign as a result. And now we're sort of growing into a full-fledged campaign. And at the core of it is a call for a rapid and just transition to a more socially owned renewable energy powered economy. And the rapid and the just are two really key elements of that, as well as the socially owned elements. And importantly, it needs to provide clean, safe, and affordable energy for all, with no worker and community left behind in the transition. So there is a full list of the demands at greenuescom.org. I'm not going to go over each one individually, but I'm going to go over the broader vision in due course. And so this is where the Green New Eskom campaign comes out of, right? But before going into the sort of solutions that we are proposing there, also want to talk about, the problems at Eskom, just so we can maybe start with maybe a similar baseline when thinking about some of the analysis around Eskom. I think all of us are painfully aware that Eskom really is on the edge at the moment. It threatens to go into a major debt spiral. It has very unreliable, aging, and expensive coal power plants, which plunge us into load shedding on a semi-regular basis. And for some of our lower income compatriots, often load reduction, which does seem quite a classist mode of trying to reduce energy load that Eskom has sort of newly begun to implement. So at the core of a lot of the issues at Eskom, of course, is the deep issues with corruption and mismanagement, which have siphoned billions or trillions rather of rands into problematic coal contracts and really, it's just, I'm trying to think of what the polite word would be to describe just the confluence of different problematic factors that has been going on around Eskom. But essentially, it has been arguably the heart of state capture and one of the biggest captured state-owned entities. And on top of all of that, it is the biggest climate polluter on the entire continent. So when it comes to climate change, it is indeed a grave threat. So that's sort of just an overview of the Eskom problem. I want to go a little bit more into the debt issue and put that into perspective. And this is a graph that comes from our booklet. Often when people talk about Eskom's debt, the blame is this little one in the corner here, the debt that municipalities owe to Eskom, right? And if you actually tally that up, that's about 40 billion, right? And the total amount of debt that Eskom has is around 500 billion around here. So you can see that, debt from municipalities is an issue, but it's quite small in the context of the broader picture, right? The thing that's a bit closer to the cost of Eskom's total debt is Kusile and Medupi, our two latest coal power plants. They were initially estimated to be around 80 billion, but cost overruns, a whole bunch of really problematic issues and supplies, contracts going over cost and so on have ballooned it to close to 500 billion, right? Which is about the same amount of Eskom's debt, right? And so I think there's often a rhetoric that tries to lay the blame for Eskom's faults on poor municipalities, bankrupt municipalities that can't pay or aren't paying Eskom. But really, in the bigger picture, that's not the biggest chunk of this issue. And then there's this big one over here, which kind of towers above the rest. And this is from a special investigative unit report that was released, I believe it was 2 years ago. Yes, 2 years ago. And basically what they investigated was that during the 2008 load shedding crisis, it may have been partly engineered by Eskom employees who ignored repeated warnings that coal stocks were running low. And then during that crisis, the emergency was used as a pretense to sign on 14 trillion rands worth of overpriced coal contracts, right, without proper tender processes, a lot of irregular tenders, and so on. So this is what the Special Investigative Unit report revealed, right? And so I think when it comes to thinking about, who is most responsible for Eskom's debt, who's most responsible for the financial woes that Eskom is in, I think the finger does have to be pointed towards these irregular coal supply contracts and these overpriced coal power plants that are driving us really deep into debt, right? And are also responsible for raising the price of electricity. So here we see first load shedding implemented, and we begin to see that the price of electricity goes quite significantly above inflation and has risen about 400% in 10 years, which might also partly explain why municipalities are struggling to pay electricity prices, because 400% in 10 years is a pretty steep increase, particularly given that South Africa's free basic electricity grant is insufficient to meet the basic needs of low-income communities. And so the poor South Africans can't afford electricity. So I think rather than blaming the poor for Eskom's woes, I think it's time that we pointed the finger to the corrupt coal contracts and the siphoning of taxpayer and ratepayer money that goes towards propping that up. At the same time that our energy prices have skyrocketed, what we've seen on the global front is that the cost of renewables have plummeted, right? Now, 10, 20 years ago, if we'd been talking about renewables, we would have been talking about a pretty expensive energy source, right? But due to pretty significant innovations in energy, what we've seen is that solar is reduced by 89%, wind by 70% in the space of 10 years, such that they are now the cheapest form of energy in most parts of the world, right? And they're continuing to get cheaper and cheaper, such that they really are beating out alternatives like coal, fossil gas, nuclear, which simply can't compete when it comes to the cost of renewable. And that's very much the case in South Africa too. It's difficult to know the costs of renewable energy in South Africa, but if you look to the history of the renewable energy auction bids in South Africa, which kind of ended really in 2015 due to a lot of complicated politics, but basically the cost of renewables was coming in a lot cheaper than coal by 2015, 2016. That, it started off more expensive because it was a new technology, and we've kind of had the learning curve in South Africa where we brought it back down to those costs, which is not to say that that renewable energy program itself was perfect. There's definitely issues with it, but this is just a reflection that renewable energy now is the cheapest form of energy in South Africa. And since 2015, those costs have come down significantly. So I think once we start getting new bid windows in on renewable energy, what we'll find is that those costs just really crush coal or fossil gas. And so that if you do an overview of just the literature on, the benefits of renewable energy, there's a lot of research from the Energy Research Center at the University of Cape Town, from the Center for Scientific Industrial Research, from international research outfits that basically show that a switch to predominantly renewable energy or 100% renewable energy would lower the cost of energy, would save hundreds of billions of liters of water, because coal is a very thirsty and water polluting form of energy, which is a pretty vital saving in a country that is as water scarce and drought stricken as ours. It's also in terms of addressing load shedding, we know that's be the fastest way to bring new energy online. And it would also, it used to be the case that fossil fuels were the more reliable way to produce energy. But what we've seen is, because of the rapid developments in storage and renewable energy technologies, actually a renewable energy system is a much more reliable form of energy production if you roll it out the right ways with the right sort of grid connections, the right sort of storage options. So that's another benefit, is more reliable energy, also remove our biggest source of pollution, and also create hundreds of thousands more jobs compared to coal, gas, and nuclear. Right? And so I think the case that's for renewables is quite significant there. And so Neil Coleman asked the question of, how do you respond to the fact that lower cost of renewables is normal and hides a range of infrastructure costs required to deliver renewable energy? Really important question, because there are significant investment costs required in grid infrastructure, in storage, And so when we're thinking about the renewable energy future, we need to be making those investments. And Eskom as a state-owned entity is arguably importantly placed to be doing that. But if you do look at system-wide analyses of the costs of a renewable energy future, which include storage, which include grid costs, they do show that system-wide renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel-based load, right? And so even if you include those hidden costs or those infrastructure costs, you're still looking at a system that brings down cost of energy and that also delivers all those other benefits too. So thanks, Neil, for that question. I think the big question is, yeah, okay, great. We want to transition to renewable energy. Hopefully most people agree on that. But the question is, what sort of transition do you want to make, right? And, you know, for us, it's vital that it's a just transition. You know, in 350 Africa, we have 3 ways of trying to sort of separate out what that transition looks like. On one hand, you have what, you know, some advocates in the renewable space are calling is kind of like just a transition. We kind of don't really change the system as it is. We kind of just replace what we've got now. That's very extractive, energy intensive system, pop in renewables, and, you know, that's the switch, right? And that's not really what we're after. The other level of a just transition then moves to a protective just transition. And that is about protecting communities and workers who might be negatively impacted, let's say in coal-intensive regions, who might lose their jobs, who might lose their livelihoods. And that's a vital element of a just transition. So, you know, I think that's key to ensuring a just transition, but that's one element of it. And often people stop at that element of it. What I think we're advocating for and trying to push in this vision of the Green New Eskom is more of this third level, which is a transformative just transition, where we use the movement towards renewable energy and the need to act on climate change as a vehicle for much deeper transformation, which puts energy justice, which puts social and economic justice and racial justice at the heart of that transformation and uses it as a vehicle for deep transformation. I think we have 2 parallel transformation requirements in South Africa that need to come together. One is based on the fact that we're the most unequal, deep poverty, high unemployment country, right? And so we need deep transformation there. On the other hand, the climate science is telling us we need deep transformation. So they need to come together, those 2 transformation requirements. One of the elements there, and also I've just been told that I should save my answer to questions to later. So just know that I'm not ignoring your questions, but we'll do it at the end. So one of those key elements of a more transformative transition is ensuring that the benefits of renewable energy go into the hands more of communities, more into the hands of South Africans, rather than to multinational corporations. And this is a relevant critique because the predominant form of delivery of renewable energy, large-scale renewable energy in South Africa, has been through the Renewable Energy Independent Power Procurement Program, which is dominated by, you know, large multinational corporations. And so a lot of the profits, a lot of the benefits, and a lot of the creation of renewables is overseas, right, and is offshored. And so this means that we're not gaining the benefits as significantly here in South Africa. So pushing for a more socially owned form of energy comes in the forms of, you know, worker cooperatives, community-owned renewable energy, municipal-owned renewable energy, and as a vital element of this is also through entities like Eskom leading the way. And a big element of that is about the green industrialization of South Africa itself, because even though the transition to renewables will create more jobs on average than a fossil fuel-based energy system would, according to pretty much every economic analysis of this, where most of the job creation lies is in the manufacture and the creation of renewables itself. And so we need strong policies in place to encourage domestic production and domestic manufacturing. And, you know, we've seen campaigns around this in the past in South Africa, and this is really important that we reignite these calls for more domestic production of renewables and related components in South Africa itself. Otherwise, we will miss out on the greatest job creation opportunities. And I think it's important that we also recognize that, you know, trade unions are a progressive voice in this space. They're often maligned or misaligned in this space as, you know, being against renewable energy. But we know that there are trade unions that are fighting for a socially owned renewable energy future, rather than the privatization of Eskom, rather than, you know, an energy system that works to benefit, you know, multinational corporations, and that leaves workers behind without just transition plans to protect them. So one element to look at here is the Eskom Transformed report that came out from this Eskom Research Reference Group, which speaks to that. And even the Climate Justice Coalition itself came out of a partnership with SAFTU. And this is a video that comes from us protesting outside the energy department together, demanding a just transition to renewable energy. I'm going to skip over it just because time is pressing, and keep on going a little bit here. So I've already spoken a little bit to this, but one of the key elements is really ensuring that the climate science is telling us that we need to transform much, much quicker, right? And in order to ensure that transformation, you know, here's a quote from Zulinzima Vavi saying that profound socio-economic transformation is the only way to achieve a zero carbon world. And the science is telling us that we need to achieve a zero carbon world quite rapidly, and within the next few decades, certainly, if we are to keep warming from crossing the vital threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that means that the electricity sector has to transform a lot more quicker, because that's the basis for decarbonizing a lot of the broader industrial systems. And so Eskom needs to be moving at a much quicker speed than it currently is, which we'll get to. So this is just a brief overview of the Green New Eskom vision. I've kind of taken you through each one of those elements already, but other elements to point out is the importance of retraining and providing job opportunities to workers, the importance of also having colleges, training centers, and job programs to ensure that folks can be part of this, because we know we face a skills deficit in South Africa when it comes to unlocking jobs in this sector. And then another element of this is also repurposing old power stations, so that a lot of those jobs are located in areas where there is already a high dependence on coal power plants and the like. And so that's a vital element of this too. I'll briefly go over Eskom's Just Energy Transition Office shared this with us. They're busy working on elements of transforming Eskom. And we've been engaging with them. We've had some conversations with their Just Energy Transition Office, their CEO. And so this is some of the stuff that they've said we can have access to. And they're going through this process of a just energy transition. They do have very text-heavy slides. I'll just try highlight the important elements of this. One of the things that they're trying to do is repurposing their old power plants. They're trying to engage in large-scale renewable energy too. They're trying to develop big financing models for climate finance that help them with this transition. And they're trying to invest in storage options, in small-scale embedded generation and grid strengthening. They're looking to green hydrogen, and they're trying to, in the long term, increase their renewable energy capacity quite significantly. And they're aiming in the long run to get to net zero by 2050. So that's kind of a rough overview. You know, I'm not here to give you the Eskom presentation, but I did think it was important to reflect on what they're doing there. I can share these slides with you so you can go over them, but this kind of repeats what they're doing there, and shows that, you know, Eskom is seeing that there are benefits from moving to this renewable energy space. And some of them are the same ones that I've been outlining there, which is not to say that us and Eskom see eye to eye, but they are starting to make some movements on this front. Some of the worries that we do have around, you know, whether Eskom will succeed is, you know, questions around implementation. What is the scale of privatization that this vision entails? There's, you know, lots of worries about wide-scale privatization. You know, we haven't seen full details yet, so the devil is in the details. And then when it comes to a just transition, there's two questions around justice, many questions around justice, but two big ones is procedural justice, who will be consulted in this process, who will be engaged, right? And then substantively, will it deliver on a just transition? Another major one is we see that the ambition is too slow. They're aiming for net zero by 2050, and we see that as being too late, right? And then there's also a big question. There's a lot of political interference in Eskom. There's a lot of corruption scandals and so on. So whether they'll actually be able to fulfill this vision remains to be seen, right? I want to focus a little bit on this one here about the ambition, because it's not really talked about as much as I think I'd like it to see it. And it's really important for us when thinking about the ambition for Eskom to realize where we are, right? So the Paris Climate Agreement said it wanted to aim for keeping global temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? And all African nations, the majority of the global south, the vast majority, small island states, least developed countries have been calling for that 1.5 degrees Celsius target, because we recognize going above it to 2 degrees Celsius condemns us to really devastating warming. So to borrow the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, global goal of 2 degrees is to condemn Africa to incineration, right? And so Eskom's target is really not in line with what would be required to get us anywhere near that 1.5. And so we really want them to push for much more ambition. And I think this graph kind of shows us, like, you know, there's a lot of science and reports that talk about net zero by 2050 as the goal we should be aiming for. But the reality, if we look at where we are with the climate, is we are spiraling very close to breaching that 1.5 target already. So hopefully this thing will start playing soon for you. There we are. And so this is tracking the global temperature change from pre-industrial levels. And that line is basically, as it gets closer and closer to that 1.5, this is the world warming, right? And as we get closer to now, we are spiraling dangerously close to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? And so the idea that we can keep polluting for another 30 years and stay within this 1.5 degrees Celsius target is somewhat fanciful. And it's based on economic models that assume all sorts of crazy geoengineering technologies that will pull greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere in the second half of the century and somehow bring us back down to 1.5. And a lot of them are unproven. They have major resource constraints on them, and they're just a massive gamble on the future of our planet. And so knowing that we're spiraling out of 1.5, I think the urgent task ahead of us is to transition much more rapidly, is to do so as quick as ethically and justly possible, right? So I'll carry on going. And the thing is, it's not just a future threat. We know that climate change, the harms that are locked in already are deeply harmful, right? And they threaten to undo all the progress we've made on eliminating poverty, on health and education. And we've seen those devastating impacts, from hurricanes in Mozambique that wipe out 90% of cities, to rain bombs that wipe out houses in KZN, to the massive droughts across Africa. Those impacts are here already. They have led to a 10 to 20% decrease in GDP, growing inequality and poverty. The studies are showing us that it's already dangerous levels of warming. And I think when we look at the possibilities for transformation, Eskom can move much faster. So I just want to point to an interesting example here from Denmark. This is their state-owned energy utility. And back in 2006, they were at a similar position to Eskom, very heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And, you know, they made a conscious decision. They said, you know what, we're going to make a much more rapid transition. And so in the space of just under 15 years, they got to 90% renewable energy, right? So they made a pretty massive transition. And this was before those rapid declines in renewable energy costs. So arguably you could do it faster now and more affordably, right? And so they've done this, they're providing affordable energy. And so this is the sort of benchmark that arguably needs to be pushed for when we're thinking about a green new Eskom. So I'm gonna maybe end with this focus on the DMRE here, because Eskom, you know, they're plans are not quite adequate to the ambition that we'd like to see, and there's big questions around whether they'll be able to deliver it, but they are starting to make some positive steps in the right direction. The place that isn't is the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. And what we see coming out of them under the leadership of Minister Montashe is a massive push for new coal, oil, and gas exploration and infrastructure. They're sabotaging and delaying renewables, never mind doing anything on socially owned. They're just killing it through all sorts of interesting new ways of doing things. And it's a very rigged and unaccountable process, right? They have no just transition plan in place for workers. They're only starting like very basic discussions around it. It's quite pitiful, really, that they are so far behind on this. They're violating the right to say no and the right for free, prior, informed consent for mining impacted communities. And they're not holding corporations accountable for social labor plans. And this really, I think, is the biggest block to the transition we need to make. And so we as the Climate Justice Coalition are actually building towards a mass mobilization targeting the DMRE. You know, they don't really respond to civil society. They don't answer letters to them. They are very unaccountable, and they often don't even provide the reasons behind their decisions. And so, you know, what we realize is that to shake this sort of institution and move it will require some pretty disruptive and radical politics. And so I think now is very much a time for escalating, and particularly because when we think about the minerals energy complex, that really is the heart of capitalist power here in South Africa. And so it's not going to shift very easily, particularly when it is deeply mired in corruption. And so the need to really ramp up and build mass mobilizations and mass movements around this is vital, right? And this is not us as the Climate Justice Coalition saying we have the answer and we're the ones who are going to do that. We really need a much bigger movement here in South Africa. We're very far behind where we need to be to make the transformation necessary. That being said, let me skip a few things here. The Green New Eskom campaign is one of our small attempts to try and contribute to pushing for a bit of a shift in this space, and this mass mobilization we're working towards is a way that we're trying to build towards that. And there we're collaborating with trade unions, with working class organizations, with mining affected communities, and with climate and environmental justice groups too. And we're also encouraging people to get involved and take action as part of the Green New Eskom campaign. So I think I'm pretty much at my time. I may have gone a minute or two over, but hopefully that provides a helpful overview. The booklet that we wrote provides a little bit more details if you'd like to dive more into it. And if you'd like to take action, you can also jump on the website and support that too. So thank you very much for having me and for listening.
Thank you so much, Alex, for this informative presentation. I am pretty much aware that we are, between the devil and the deep blue sea when it comes to implementing, the transition from non-renewable energy to clean energy, like renewable energy such as solar or wind power. And you've also reflected on how, the DNA of South Africa's political economy is still pretty much a reflection of the mineral energy complex that pretty built most South African cities. I mean, some of South African towns or cities are even named after, a coal, like Emalahleni, for example. So I'll just dive into the questions and you can respond to the questions. I know you can see the questions, but I'll just read them anyway. So you've responded to the first one from Neil. I'll go to the second one from Martin. Will the lower cost of renewable energy be passed on to consumers? Any practical example where this has happened? I'll also ask a second question, and then you can attend to the question. Does your research include the cost of RI4P in the power purchase agreement that Eskom pays? If you can attend to those questions, Alex.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think, will the lower cost of renewables be passed on to consumers? It very much depends on how we structure things. And so I think there are examples where that happens. You know, there are examples of people, obviously investing in their own renewables where that lowers the costs for them. But I think when we're thinking about, an Eskom-wide or a nationwide large-scale rollout, provided that, bodies like NERSA are regulating the cost of energy in a way that the costs of renewables that are bringing down our energy system costs then get passed on to consumers, it should be the case, but should is not always will, right? And so I think there is an important political struggle to be had to ensure that those benefits do get passed on to consumers. I mean, there is vast potential for those lower costs to be passed on, but it's not a guarantee that they will be. So I think an important question there. So a question about if my research includes the cost of REI4P in the power purchase agreements that Eskom pays. So I haven't done initial sort of research on the economic costs of it myself. So I'm more drawing on the research of others that have done the economic modeling here. And, there is research that, does reflect on the cost of the power purchasing agreements with the renewable energy. And it is important to note that some of those earlier power purchasing agreements with renewables were quite expensive. The earlier ones that we did were more expensive than the later ones, which came in cheaper than coal. And so I think there's a lot of worries about those early bids. And so there are some efforts to try and renegotiate those early bids because they are quite expensive. Some are willing to bite the bullet and say that was the learning cost for bringing on new renewable energy, but there is a push to try and negotiate those earlier power purchasing agreements to bring down the costs, given that they were more expensive. But nowadays, if we were to make that transition, or if we were to implement renewables, it would be significantly cheaper, as most of that economic modeling shows. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I'll take the next two questions. One from Andres. When do you think net zero can be achieved? As you argue that 2050 is too late. What steps can be done to fasten this process? And then the other one from Philip. Do you think there might be any future for thorium-based nuclear? Would rather have Eskom spend 500 billion on exploring this technology. All the good things we read about thorium, much less waste, much less radioactive waste, potentially not dependent on water coolant, cannot be weaponized. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think the net zero target it depends on who we're talking about here. I think for Eskom, there's evidence that shows we could move towards 100% renewable energy. I mean, there's some very optimistic stuff that says by 2030, that's probably faster than anybody, most people in Eskom would be willing to contemplate. But 2035, 2040 is certainly doable, according to some economic modeling that's out there. In terms of the rest of the country moving to net zero, and I think this is why it's really vital that Eskom moves first, is because for the rest of the country to get to net zero, we're going to have a zero carbon energy source so that we can electrify things like transport and industry and other related sectors. Even aviation might require things like green hydrogen, which would be produced by renewable energy, which is becoming more affordable, right? And is projected to become, economic within the decade or so, on things like those sorts of industrial applications for steel, for aviation, and so on. And this is not even by environmentalists, but by sort of mainstream economic groups. So I think there is studies that show that the world as well can get to net zero by 2045 globally. And this is by the likes of Project Drawdown. And they use existing technologies, existing solutions. And so that's some of the more ambitious pathways that are out there. And I really do think that the sooner we move to zero, the better. And we also need to be careful about the net and net zero and what that hides, because, you know, even Eskom in their net zero, they're pretending that they're going to try and run coal into the next half of the century and then get it to zero, the net zero, by investing in things like plantations and carbon capture and sequestration and so on, which is a really problematic element. Now, Eskom did say that they might be willing to move the zero earlier, so before 2050, if the technologies shift. I would say that arguably the technology has already shifted and they need to move much, much faster. So sorry, it's a bit of a long-winded way to answer the question. It's certainly a very complex question when we think about global justice in terms of who needs to be moving first. Certainly the global north needs to be moving much, much faster to net zero, and needs to be paying a huge amount more in climate debt to the global south. And South Africa is a bit of a complicated one because we're both a climate villain and victim at the same time, with our minerals energy complex being, you know, a big contributor to the problem, but the vast majority of South Africans barely contributing anything to it in terms of emissions. Okay, thorium. Oh, thorium, hey? You know, it's nuclear and is a really tricky one. You know, our current nuclear power in South Africa is providing relatively carbon-free electricity, relatively reliably, certainly relative to our coal base. And so shutting down nuclear early, I think, can be problematic. What we've seen in places like Germany is they shut down their nuclear early. And as a result, they had to ramp up a lot of coal power. And there was a lot more harm that happened because coal has a lot more pollution, contributes a lot more to climate change. And so I would argue that that particular form of earlier nuclear retirement was problematic. However, when we're looking at new energy, it's a different equation, right? Renewables are much cheaper than new nuclear. I'm not talking about thorium yet, I'm talking about standard nuclear technologies. So renewables are much cheaper than new nuclear. They're much quicker to bring on board, which is particularly relevant when trying to deal with an issue like load shedding. And I mean, nuclear is just prohibitively expensive. It's crazy expensive, such that, you know, the nuclear pipeline is drying up across the world. It's just not proving economic, right? Now, for the longest time, there's been talk of next generation nuclear technologies. Bill Gates loves talking about next generation nuclear technologies, probably because he's invested in one company that actually does that. He's the chairman of a company called TerraPower, which is trying to promote this stuff. Bill Gates is a super problematic figure in this space, but that's a discussion for another talk, perhaps. And he's been promoting a lot of next generation nuclear technologies. But the problem with a lot of them is that they're not commercially viable yet, right? They are future technologies that might materialize, right? Even Bill Gates has admitted that, you know, some of his next generation nuclear might come into, you know, a test phase in like 10 years time. And then there's the question of scaling it up to commercial level, which often takes decades or even longer. And so in terms of a widespread rollout of these sort of next generation nuclear technologies, we're just not yet there yet. And as I showed on the talk, the climate crisis is busy spiraling out of control. We need to act urgently. So placing a bet that maybe these next generation nuclear technologies might come about is kind of like waiting for possible miracles to happen when we do have the technologies that are needed to make the shift now. And it's not to say that, you know, renewable energy is the be all and end all, but it is, you know, it can provide us with the energy, but we also need, you know, things like energy efficiency. We do need to invest in things like research and development for new technologies as well. So it's not to say don't invest in R&D, but it's saying don't wait for like energy miracles like thorium, like next generation nuclear, while we have the tools we need to get to the task right now, would be my answer there.
Thank you, Alex. Neil has posed another question. Any reflections on Green New Deal initiatives in other parts of the world, including the role of unions and other civil society groups? And also, Andres posed a very interesting question. The energy space is becoming highly contested, and we are seeing influential players playing within this space. Don't you think we'll have a repeat of the mineral energy complex in the name of the climate. Because capitalism has a tendency of replicating itself. So won't we have the same problem within the clean technology space?
Fantastic questions. I really appreciate them. So yeah, the Green New Deal initiatives in the other parts of the world, essentially what they're revolving around is this idea of a transformative climate justice agenda that brings together economic, racial, gender justice in this really significant bid to have a much more radical approach to climate change, which isn't about like little carbon taxes on the side that slowly move us towards renewable energy. It's about mass investment in transforming our infrastructure. And it's also about putting in place the sorts of social support policies that would allow us to make that transition without people falling through the cracks. And so those social safety policies are things like Medicare for all, jobs guarantees, investing in just transition and retraining for workers. And I think these are really vital. If you look at countries where they've been able to make the most rapid transition, they also tend to have the strongest social safety nets, right? And so if we want to enact this broad transformational agenda, we do need to ensure that we put in place the socioeconomic transformation that goes with it, right? And that means that, I must be honest here, South Africa is one of the hardest places to do this. We're one of the most unequal countries. Our social safety net is gutted. Our government is pushing forward a horrific austerity program in the midst of an economic crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen for about a century, which is insane economic policy. And so in terms of a Green New Deal, we desperately need something like that in South Africa, but we haven't built, I don't think yet, the political base. The left in South Africa is at a historically weak position now. And so in terms of building the coalitions, in terms of building the mass-based movement that could make something like a Green New Deal happen, and one that is, you know, rooted in South Africa, coming from the grassroots rather than imported from elsewhere, I think will take us a while to get to. And so we've got a lot of work ahead of us to get there. So I think we really need something like a Green New Deal in South Africa. And I think we also need to think about the need for a global Green New Deal because, you know, this is entrenched in these global capital flows. It is entrenched in these global inequalities. And so if we don't also contest those international spaces, it's very hard to implement a domestic Green New Deal at the same time. And then, so to speak to energy, to the question of the mineral energy complex in the name of the climate, I think that's a real worry. You know, we do see in terms of who's entering the renewable energy space, you start to see oil and gas companies investing in it, not very much. They're mostly still sticking to their oil and gas base. But there are like big multinational corporations that are driving a lot of this. And they are driven also by a profit motive. And so we must be very careful about, as climate justice movements, not aligning ourselves with green capital, right? If green capital is going to be rapacious too. You know, there's things like, you look at Elon Musk and he tweets jokingly about coups in Bolivia, right? Where, you know, there has been some evidence of, you know, companies that are trying to seek lithium for battery technologies being involved in extractive and really problematic practices there that harm local communities. And so are trying to push back against, you know, visions of mineral ownership that are more based in control by communities or countries. And so there is already, I think, a minerals energy complex developing in the name of climate. And so we do need to be very careful about that. And I think this once again speaks to the need to think about global supply chains and how they're involved in the development of renewable energy, and to push for something very different, and to push for supply chain justice in how we develop renewable energy, and to also push for a different model of ownership in how we roll it out at the end, right? But it's not clear that that's going to be the case, that we're going to have a different energy complex, or whether the renewables will be, driven by a similar sort of profit extractive motive. Renewables, they do tend to have less harm on an overall level than fossil fuels, but there's still harms involved. And so if we aren't pushing for ecological justice, if we aren't pushing for justice for mining impacted communities, then we risk exacerbating a lot of problematic dynamics, even if we're reducing the overall harm that fossil fuels bring relative to renewables. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Alex. I see Michelle wants to engage with you. You can go ahead, Michelle.
Thanks. I'm just showing my face for a minute, but I'll. Yeah, thanks, Alex. Sorry, I was typing and then enter just happened, so I didn't complete my question. But so I'm myself working on and rethinking renewable energy transitions, and in the midst of hopefully completing my PhD in July. But I'm feeling that there's slippages in your proposed solutions and ideas. And so one, the idea of socially owned energy transitions, and then the response is that it's co-ops or worker controlled. But, are we speaking about the same kind of technology driven approaches, but it's just differently governed? That's number one. Number two is that the focus on this kind of carbon free and low carbon, as if carbon's the enemy, whereas if we had changed our ways we consume and produce food, and soil was more diverse and needs a lot of carbon, there'd be a whole a different, I guess there would be, I guess possibilities of contributing to the climate chaos situation. But the reductionist focus is this kind of way of thinking that if we just replace coal and steam engines and all its carbon equivalents with green energy, all will be well in a world organized around the racial, class, and gender cosmologies that capitalism depends. So yes, so I feel that there's a very narrow focus on this idea that we should get green energy or low carbon, and then all will be well. So that's my comment and concern.
Thank you, Michelle. You can respond, Alex.
Thanks, Stanford, and thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I think you're right to suggest that it's not the case that if we switch to renewables, all will be well. The focus of this talk was obviously on the energy sector, so I am focusing a lot on the fact that we do need to transition away from coal. And I agree there needs to be much broader socioeconomic transformation and the challenging of the very rapacious economic system, which is at the heart of driving this crisis, that should be happening. And things like soil carbon, looking at our industrial agricultural systems and replacing them with more regenerative agriculture, overhauling an economic system driven by the profit motive are all vital elements of it. There's a lot of steps that we need to take to get there. So I don't want to deny the vital importance of that. At the same time, in terms of transforming our energy space, renewables do provide significant benefits relative to our current energy system. And that's not just say, let's just replace our current energy system and put renewables in it. No, we need to be investing significantly in ways to reduce the amount of energy we use and put in place energy efficiency. We need to be thinking differently about how we build our economies and how they use energy. These are all vital, bigger questions we need to be addressing. But there is this urgent need to also transition our energy systems to less harmful energy sources. Because when it does come to the climate crisis, it is the case that fossil fuels are the predominant driver by a long shot. And so if we don't get that right, if we don't make that transition away from them, then a lot of the other stuff that we're trying to do just won't, it will be swarmed by the ongoing climate crisis. So none of this is to deny the need for broader transformation, but this is to say this is one piece of that needed transformation, and that it does need to be guided by these broader questions of social, ecological justice and transformation as we do that.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I think I've got one more question from Erwin. When talking about a green transition in other parts of the world, how will oil-rich countries respond? For example, Nigeria and Saudi Arabia. What is different about them than South Africa with coal? I'm just thinking about all the geostrategic conflicts that arise just because of oil.
Yeah, that is a very big and important question. In some of my earlier days as a researcher, I did spend quite a bit of time thinking about, the questions of what they call stranded assets for countries like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, whose oil and gas production, is arguably going to become uneconomic if we make the necessary transition to renewable energy, to climate change, and to broader action that's required, right? And so I think this poses major challenges for the likes of Nigeria and Saudi Arabia. I think this is part of the reason why Saudi Arabia has often been one of the countries that has blocked climate action at the international level and has, been implicated in a lot of really problematic practices. And it is because this transformation really threatens to upend a lot of our current geopolitical order. In a lot of ways, our current version of global capitalism is fueled by fossil fuel driven imperialism, right? I mean, the US empire is very much based on that. All of its problematic imperial excursions into the Middle East are driven by a significant drive for fossil fuel access, right? And so this does threaten to upend the geopolitical order. And I think that's part of the reason why climate change has been so hard to act on, partly because we haven't properly paid attention to these power dynamics, but also because those power dynamics are against one of the most powerful industries in the world that is so deeply embedded within states and state-owned entities across the planet, right? So this is going to be a really significant transformation, and arguably these oil and gas dependent states, in terms of the amount of money they stand to lose, is quite a bit more than coal dependent states, but which is not to say that South Africa won't also be significantly impacted as well.
Thank you, Alex. One more question from Neil. Have you been able to present your ideas to policymakers in the state and the governing party? And what type of response have you had?
So we have been able to present them, not by invitation though. We have, had protests and marches to the DMRE, to the president's office, at the union buildings. We've delivered them to the Minister of Finance. And the response, unfortunately, is quite disappointing. The state doesn't really respond to this. The ruling party likes to talk left and walk right on this issue, like on so many others. The president loves to talk about renewable energy. He brings up a young climate activist and talks about them and their sonar and includes them in the Presidential Coordinating Commission on Climate Change. And then he turns around and makes a deal with the Chinese to build one of the new massive industrial coal power plants in Limpopo, right? It's hypocrisy, right? And so, when your president is a former coal tycoon and the head of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy also has that background, it's not a surprise that they're not very responsive to these ideas. And I think this is why we recognize the need to build something much more significant and move towards more mass mobilization, because otherwise, we will again be ignored And so there is a need to do more on this front. We have had responses from Eskom, though. So we've met with the Eskom CEO, we've met with the Just Energy Transition Office. They're sympathetic to a lot of our ideas. There's some good people in Eskom that are trying to move some of this forward, but there's also a lot of political maneuvering that is probably getting in the way. And as I've tried to outline, you know, Eskom is not 100% aligned with our vision, but they are making some moves at least.
Okay, if you can quickly attend to this question by Sinobile, and then we can just close the presentation. How do we ensure that people of color and people in rural areas are not excluded in the idea of moving to a zero carbon world?
Such an important and big question, and again should be the topic of another talk entirely. You know, I think that this is a really major worry because a lot of these conversations are happening in urban centers, are driven, you know, in a place like South Africa by, you know, white, more middle class folks have more access to these spaces. And so when it comes to ensuring that there is not an exclusion, I think there's a few things that need to happen. One is procedural justice. We need to ensure that when it comes to making these plans, who's at the table, who's involved in making this happen, that people of color, that people in rural areas are at the heart of that decision making and of building what this new future looks like, right? And part of that comes to things like free, prior, informed consent, right? The Department of Mineral Resources and Energy is pushing back against that. It has been violating in a lot of ways. So they're moving towards disempowering rural people. And some of the recent laws passed, like the Khoisan bill, what was the full name of it? I forget right now, is rolling back some of those protections for rural communities around consent and involvement in developments. And so there's a big struggle ahead on that front. And so I think both the climate justice movement needs to do some serious thinking about, you know, how do they transform themselves? Because globally, but in South Africa, there is still, you know, they're not the most transformed space. And so in terms of ensuring that rural peoples and people of color are leading that call, I think there's a lot of work still to be done there. You know, and yeah, and I think there's just, yeah, I'll maybe leave it there, but there's so much more that I should and could touch on and that we need to dive into in order to answer that question, because it is such a vital one.
Thank you so much, Alex. Before I can close, let me just read from Neil. While what you're saying about the state ANC may be true in general sense, I think you should consider that there may be different views in these spaces on the issues which may be basis for engagement. Either way, much stronger mobilization is required, as you correctly say. Happy to explore ideas on this further. Thank you, Neil.
I agree with Neil there.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much, Alex, for your time. Let me hand over to Andries. Andries?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you as well, Alex, for making time to come share your work with us. If there are any future collaborations there are, or you have anything that you want to do within CCS, you can let us know. And to everyone that is not on our mailing list, if you want to hear more about the CCS future webinars, you can send us your details so that we add you to our mailing list, or you can look for us on Facebook and other social media platforms for any webinars that will happen. Thanks to everyone, and thank you very much to you, Alex.
Thank you very much for having me, and I really appreciate the critical feedback. Really, if you have any more, feel free to send it my way. I'm always looking for more on this front, and we're not saying we have all the answers, but this is one of our attempts to try move things forward. So thank you, and a real pleasure to engage with you all.